Oh, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. You are tuned in to the 2026 staging of the International Reparation Debate Competition. It has been a wonderful time so far. This is match number 9. We will see two teams facing off against each other. The teams in question are, of course, Holy Faith Convent Couva and Fatima College. Fun fact that I just learned, Holy Faith Convent is an all-girls school and Fatima College is an all-boys school. So, it's girls versus boys in this context. I'm sure it's gonna be fun. Of course, this competition would not have been possible without the help from some awesome people and organizations. So, we want to take the opportunity to thank very much the University of the West Indies, the Center for Reparation Research, the UWI Press, Jade, the University of Hull, and of course our main partner, the Repair Campaign. I am Ravan Thomas Matthews, and for the purposes of this match, I will be the chair judge. Of course, joining me on my panel are two other amazing judges who will ask to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Matthew White.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matthew White. I will be one of the wing judges this afternoon or this morning. I am delighted to be here, and I hope that the best man or woman wins.
Thank you very much. And of course, Chantel Hughes.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chantel Hughes, serving as a wing adjudicator today, and I'm wishing both teams best of luck.
Thank you very much, Chantel. So those are your judges. Let's hear from our debaters. We invite the team in proposition, Holy Faith Convent Couva, to introduce themselves.
Hi, good day everyone. I am the first speaker, Vandana Fakira.
I am your second speaker, Ishana Ramli.
And I am your third speaker, Ashley Barrett.
Awesome. Thank you very much, ladies. And of course, your opponents from Fatima College.
Good day, everyone. I am Hagan Alexander, the first speaker.
My name is Ken Diwali. I'm the second speaker.
My name is Adam Alves, the third speaker.
All right, there you go. You have your debaters. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion that will govern this context before us is a really exciting and interesting one. Yes, and I know that the teams are ready and excited to hear it. The motion, of course, governing this match being this House believes that reparative compensation should be distributed based on racial background as opposed to geographical location. Wow, that's an interesting motion, and I'm sure that the teams are going to break it down for us in a way that we can all understand, appreciate, and therefore form our very own opinions on. The rules governing this debate are as follows. First speakers, you will have 7 minutes to present your case. Second speakers, you will have 6 minutes. And the third and final speakers from each team will have 5 minutes. It's important to note that the first and last minute of each speech is considered protected time. During protected time, no points of information will be allowed. Outside of protected time, points of information are not only allowed, they're absolutely encouraged and expected. Of course, we have 2 exciting periods of cross-examination, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we get there. You've heard enough from me. You want to hear from your debaters. And with that regard, I would like to call this the 9th match of round 1 to order by inviting the first speaker from Holy Faith Convent Couva, Vandana Fakira.
Thank you. I will begin In 3, 2, 1. Reparations are not a charity, but a response to a specific historical crime carried out against a specific people, producing identifiable and enduring harm. Therefore, justice demands precision, not convenience, as stated by Ta-Nehisi Coates in 2024. Mr. Chair, honorable adjudicators, timekeeper, worthy opponents, and my fellow debaters, a pleasant good day to all of you. Today, this House stands firmly in support of the motion that states reparative compensations should be distributed based on racial background or heritage as opposed to geographical location or nationality. Before I begin, please allow me to define the key terms of this motion. Firstly, reparative compensations, which refer to the measures used to redress violations of human rights by providing a range of material and symbolic benefits to victims or their families, as well as affected communities, as stated by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2024. Secondly, racial background or heritage, which can be defined as a social classification based on a person's ethnicity, ancestry, or inherited perceived physical characteristics, as stated by the Office of Human Rights in 2022. And thirdly, geographical location or nationality, which refers to distributing compensations by modern state borders or citizenship status, regardless of whether or not the recipients are descendants of the harmed group. Now, in my argument, I will be presenting 3 compelling points. Firstly, reparations must follow the victim, not the map. Secondly, geographic distribution produces moral absurdities. And thirdly, reparations are about repairing intergenerational harm. My colleague and illustrious Deputy Prime Minister will further elucidate on 2 compelling points. Nationality-based distribution misallocates reparations, and heritage-based distribution is the fairest and most workable with real-world precedent. I will now open this argument with my first point. Firstly, reparations must follow the victim group that was racialized and not the map. Let me make this clear. Enslavement was not committed against countries. It was committed against African people, selected, enslaved, and dehumanized because of their race. Furthermore, the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement, and colonial racial systems were not random historical accidents. They were organized, legalized, and enforced through racial categories, creating enduring disadvantages that persist through ancestry. And just to seal off the deal, according to the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, it recognizes enslavement and the slave trade as a crime against humanity, ladies and gentlemen, and they further link these histories to present-day racism experienced by African people and people of African descent, as according to, once again, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2024. And furthermore, for example, CARICOM's Reparation Commission frames the case explicitly for indigenous and African descendant communities harmed by genocide, enslavement, and racial apartheid. And its 10-point plan, ladies and gentlemen, is built around repairing these communities. So if CARICOM's claimant group is heritage-based, shouldn't distribution be heritage-based as well? Secondly, geographic distribution produces moral absurdities, ladies and gentlemen. A nationality-based system leads to ethically indefensible outcomes, as a white descendant of European plantation owners living in the Caribbean qualifies for reparations, but a black descendant of enslaved Africans living in, let's say, the UK or the US or Canada does not. That is not justice, ladies and gentlemen. It is bureaucratic convenience masquerading as morality. Furthermore, reparations...
Point of information.
Accepted.
Are you aware that according to Dr. Eric Williams, Chapter 1 of Capitalism and Slavery, the Negro slave was not the first slave. It was first white indentured servants and then the indigenous peoples. They only went to African enslavement due to the fact that the Africans worked the best in those conditions. It was not strictly race-based.
Okay, whereas I hear the opposition's point, we are here to say that the Africans were still enslaved. It does not dispute the fact that they were affected and that they were a victim group that was racialized. Which brings me further down into my argument that reparations that ignore race, dilute accountability, reward historical beneficiaries, and re-victimize the descendants of the enslaved by denying their claim if they migrated. If trauma is portable, shouldn't justice also be portable? And my last point, ladies and gentlemen, reparations are about repairing intergenerational harm. The harm of slavery is not abstract. It is measurable and inherited due to racial wealth gaps, health disparities, educational inequalities, cultural erasure, and psychological trauma. These harms, they persist along racial lines, not national ones. And furthermore, according to the World Bank in 2018, sociological and economic data across the Caribbean, Europe, and North America are all consistently show that African descendants remain disproportionately disadvantaged. And these disadvantages track race even when the geography changes. Therefore, House, we are here to tell you that reparations divorced from race are reparations in name only. And if we erase race from reparations, we erase responsibility, we erase history, and we erase justice. And without justice, there can be no repair. Thank you very much.
And thank you. That was the first speaker from the team in Proposition Holy Faith Convent, Couva. We now invite the first speaker from Fatima College to present the case for side opposition, that speaker being Hagan Alexander.
Good morning. Are you hearing me?
Ready when you are, Hagan.
3, 2, 1. Good day, judges, listeners, and my worthy opponents. I am Hagan Alexander. Today, we debate a motion where the intention is ambitious, but the method of distribution is fundamentally impractical. We firmly believe that reparations should be distributed based on geographical location rather than racial background. Our position is based on optimal fairness and effectiveness. We oppose race-based distribution as it is unfair and undermines the very justice that reparations seek to achieve. Race-based reparations compensate families based on racial heritage, whilst geographic reparations compensate countries and regions harmed by colonial systems. The proposition must prove that race is a fair and workable basis for reparation distribution. We will show that it is not. My 2 points are, number 1, reparations must deal with colonial systems which were established on a geographical basis, and 2, race-based distribution is conceptually incoherent and challenging to apply fairly. My second speaker will discuss the immense importance of reparations with respect to climate crisis. But first, in rebuttal, these colonial powers harmed nations, not just races. According to Dr. Eric Williams, enslavement was first an economic system, not a racial one. It was an economic system which forcibly extracted resources from nations. These nations and their citizens have a claim to reparations, which brings me to my first point. In his book, Dr. Eric Williams said in the Capitalism and Slavery, Caribbean enslavement built up European wealth and left our region scarred and underdeveloped. Please note those 2 words, our region. At the core of this topic, reparations are not just about racial identity. It is about repairing systems which were geographical, structural, and institutional. According to worldbank.org, regions exposed to the most exploitive colonial rule now have about 30% lower GDP per capita. This highlights how deeply colonial systems have shaped real economic outcomes. This phenomenon affected entire populations, making racial division for reparations unnecessary. Geographic reparations address this matter at its base, with reparations being invested in education, infrastructure, and healthcare. It benefits both the present and future generations. Our approach is consistent with the nation's sovereignty and competency. Caribbean economist Lloyd Bess argued that post-colonial states accepted.
So the opposition is stating that these reparations will be used for things like education and healthcare. Now, the nation that has to provide these reparations, doesn't it increase the amount of revenue that they need to earn from their taxpayers in order to be able to give reparations to an entire nation versus just a racial group?
That's time for your question.
Well, reparations are also funded by donations, and then these countries still exploit their former colonies countries to this day. So, example, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, up to this day, they are still exploited for their resources, which these quote-unquote countries need to use. So, to answer your question, these countries can utilize the resources that they already steal from the former colonial nations. Continuing on, Caribbean economist Lloyd Bess argued that post-colonial states inherited economic and political systems which were designed for extraction, not development, including the Westminster parliamentary model. Reparations, when geographically directed, allow nations the opportunity to design local systems rather than using colonial frameworks on a case-by-case basis. In his book, Dr. Eric Williams further demonstrates that Caribbean underdevelopment was not accidental. European industrial growth was directly financed by wealth extracted from former colonial territories, not solely racial background. Geographic reparations gives the opportunity to build patriotism, innovation, and empower societies to become architects of their futures. A study published in World Development found that extractive institutions face persistent development challenges. This highlights that institutional reform and it is relevant. Move me on to point number 2. The proposition stance immediately crumbles as race-based distributions present challenges to fairly administer. Former colonial nations like Trinidad and Tobago, populations are highly mixed and intertwined. According to the Central Statistical Office, mixed heritage people are 18.5% of this population. If compensation is based on racial heritage, then these questions must be answered. How much ancestry is enough? Will it be a grandparent or even a great-grandparent? Will it be a DNA percentage declined? Who is responsible for designating this cutoff point and criteria? DNA testing can be expensive and is unsuitable. According to scienceinsights.org, genetic ancestry testing results can vary significantly due to recombination, complicating the detection of clear ancestral lines. Further use of race-based models can lead to false claims. This is not justice. Ultimately, a policy rooted in unclear beneficiaries may lack the ability to deliver favorable outcomes. Instead of repairing historical injustice, race-based reparations risk recreating new forms of exclusion, resentment, and division amongst citizens. The proposition will make the argument, and they have, that slavery was racial. However, racial degradation was enforced through colonial systems which affected laws, entire territories, and their economies. Reparations should be designed to repair systems, not just identity. Judges, our case is simple. Firstly, reparations should repair colonial systems which affect entire nations, and these systems are geographic, institutional, and generational. Secondly, race-based reparations are impractical. They are expensive, divisive, and impossible to apply fairly. Justice must rebuild what was broken, and what was broken was our region, not just a bloodline. Reparations should not divide people based on race. They should unite societies and rebuild our space, not tracing bloodlines or by drawing new lines, but repairing the systems broken over time. Mr. Speaker, we ask you to oppose this motion. I thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the first speaker from Fatima College, Hagan Alexander. Now, I would have hinted earlier at something exciting for you, and we're at that juncture in the debate. Yes? And so, we're going to enter into the period of cross-examination. The rules governing cross-examination are as follows. Team opposition. You will pose 3 questions to the team in proposition. Each question will last 10 seconds. Team proposition. You will respond to those questions. You have 45 seconds to do so. It's important to note that only one person on the team asking a question can do so at any given point in time. But for the team that is answering that question, the entire team can chime in to do so as long as you do it within that 45-second constraint. After team opposition has posed their 3 questions and team proposition has answered them, we will give the same privilege to team proposition, who will pose their 3 questions. All right, with the rules out of the way, we invite both teams to unmute their mics and ask Team Fatima College to field their first question.
Question number 1. In the case of mixed-race individuals, how exactly do you define who racially qualifies for reparations?
Thank you for your question. So, anyone, whether if they will take an ancestry test or a DNA test, anyone that has a percentage of, let's just say, African blood, for example, will qualify for reparations as they qualify under the victimized group that was racialized.
Number 2. Why should people living in formerly colonized countries, exploited countries, receive nothing just because they don't racially qualify?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Persons who live in formerly colonized countries which are affected by the harms, why should they receive nothing because they don't racially qualify?
Thank you for your question again. So they should not racially qualify, for the most part, because the country itself was not affected. It was the people within the country that were enslaved that were affected.
It was the people, the specific group of people that were targeted. It wasn't the country or the nation itself that was targeted.
Exactly. And our stance on this motion is that persons should receive reparations based on on the victimized groups that were racialized.
And number 4, what body will decide racial eligibility for reparations? And how does this avoid being arbitrary? Because you mentioned in your point of information, a body will be responsible. Which body is that?
Okay, thank you for your question once again. So the body that we will be responsible would be the nation that is one giving the reparations, and also the nation in somewhat that is receiving it. But here's how this is going to work. The people have to provide that DNA test or that ancestry record to show that they are part of the heritage that was racially victimized. And that will be the governing body that will decide that. It is a compromise between the government and also the person that is requesting the reparation or is to receive the reparation.
Just to be clear with this, we aren't saying that the nation is going to be receiving the reparations and then distributing. We are saying that the persons who are eligible must provide information and proof that they're eligible for it.
Which is also something that we highlighted through the usage of a blood test or ancestry test. As you all know, there's a very popular one called Ancestry.com, which is quite accurate.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much. We now invite team proposition to pose their questions to team opposition.
Question number 1. If reparations are about justice, shouldn't eligibility be based on who was harmed rather than where they live?
Okay, yes, thank you for your question. We contend that entire states were harmed, and the people of that state, which was formerly harmed, need state restoration. A perfect example of this is Haiti, where there was the independence debt and the forcible extraction of their wealth. Those people, all those people, need reparations.
Okay. Second question. What specific enforcement mechanisms can you use to ensure direct benefit to the harmed communities?
Well, there are many avenues for this. One avenue could be the United Nations. Another avenue could be the Center for Reparations Research, and also the CARICOM 10-point plan, which outlines debt cancellation and educational opportunities. We do not have to funnel money into states, especially if those states are corrupt. We can funnel resources into those states, which will directly help those people.
Okay, and final question. Are reparations meant to repair harm or stimulate national development?
This is not about national development stimulation. These nations, we contend, which were exploited and their wealth was extracted from them, they need reparations as a state. As citizens of those societies, those people require reparations.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, both teams. At this point in time, we're going to invite the second speaker from the team in proposition. That is Ashana Ramdin.
Okay, I will begin in 3, 2, 1. A pleasant good morning once again, Honorable Chairperson, distinguished adjudicators, my worthy opponents, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, please allow me to reiterate the points that were brought forward by my illustrious first speaker and Prime Minister Vandana Fikira. Firstly, that reparations must follow the victim, not the map. Secondly, that geographic distribution of reparations produces moral absurdities. And thirdly, that reparations are about repairing intergenerational harm. Now, before I begin my arguments, please allow me to rebut some of the points that were mentioned by the opposition. The opposition stated that it was nations that were harmed, not just individuals. But as my first speaker already stated, we have made it clear that it was not nations who suffered. It was the enslaved Africans, the specific group of people that were harmed. Secondly, the opposition stated that reparations were about repairing systems. No, reparations are about repairing harm. They're about correcting an injustice. Now, as second speaker and deputy prime minister, I will be presenting two compelling arguments. Firstly, that nationality-based distribution of reparations misallocates these resources. And secondly, that heritage-based distribution of reparations already has a strong real-world precedent. To begin, nationality-based distribution of reparations can misallocate these resources. By distributing reparations based on nationality or geographical location, we will inevitably end up paying many people who are simply not the descendants of the harmed group and ignore those who are, especially the diaspora. How does the opposition propose we account for the people outside of those geological borders? Reparations are not about repairing injustice, they are about repairing a specific harm, and modern borders are simply not moral boundaries. The descendants of the enslaved Africans, the indigenous people, they are scattered all over the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and beyond. According to Reuters 2024, the United Nations Permanent Forum and related United Nations discussions are increasingly emphasizing tangible steps towards enslavement reparations on a group basis. Why? Because they acknowledge and they recognize that the harm caused was group linked. It was racially linked. It was not nation linked like the opposition wants you to believe. Secondly, we cannot ignore the fact that heritage-based reparations already has a strong real-world precedent. The most credible models of reparations are those that distribute and compensate the victims directly, or their ancestors, not everyone who just happens to live in the same modern boundary.
Are you
Reparation-
aware? Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Point of information. Sorry.
Yes, accepted.
Are you aware that after the Holocaust, the state of Israel, and I repeat, the state, the nationality or Israel, was given direct reparations, not Jews?
Actually, I have a point to that which I will come to later if you'll allow me. So reparations, to continue, are simply about correcting a specific racial wrong. And to do that, we need rules of eligibility linked to victimhood, not nationality, not geography. For example, as you would have just mentioned, opposition, in terms of the Holocaust, when Germany had to pay reparations, they actually, according to the United States Department of State, they actually paid reparations to the specific Jewish survivors and the victims of their descendants. It was based on heritage and it was based on lineage. It was not based on nationality.
Point of information.
Accept it. Accept it.
Enslavement is a historical harm. When you have real-world survivors, the question of who deserves it is more clear. How do you justify that claim and translate it to historical harm with descendants?
Well, at the end of the day, it is an historical claim, and the historical injustice was based on race, which is why we are saying that the reparations, which are meant to repair that historical injustice, should also be based on race. Therefore, it should trace their descendants and their heritage. Now, another example of heritage-based distribution would have been the United States Civil Liberties Act of 1998, where Japanese Americans were provided with redress for their incarceration. Another defined victim group. It was not to all Japanese Americans, not to all United States citizens. It was not to all the residents of the affected states. It was to the specific Japanese Americans, the specific group of people that were harmed. Overall, heritage-based and race-based distribution of reparations are simply to ensure that compensation reaches those who experienced and experience the social, economic, and psychological impact of racial oppression. Because if reparations are to be successful, they must acknowledge that the crimes that were committed were racial crimes. They were not geographical ones. Thank you.
And thank you very much to the second speaker from Team in Proposition Holy Faith Convent. We now invite the second speaker from Fatima College, Kennedy Valley.
Can I be heard?
Ready when you are, Kennedy.
Okay. One second, let me just deal with some background noise. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Speaker, when the wind topples houses, when the rain roars, when the sea level rises and the temperatures rise even faster, reparations must not be distributed by race, but by the geographical regions still enshackled by colonial legacies, the regions in the most danger. This leads to our third substantive argument. The Caribbean deserves and desperately needs reparations on a geographical basis because our nations were systematically underprepared by colonial powers to combat climate change. But briefly, a rebuttal. Judges, let it not be lost on you that the proposition is yet to provide a mechanism for their racial reparations. They make moral assertions, yes. They say those of African and indigenous descent were harmed intergenerationally, despite the fact that nations were too generationally and systematically harmed. But they must defend how and why their mode of distribution would work. As our first speaker has mentioned, it faces many flaws in terms of who qualifies racially. By contrast, our model works under systems in the status quo, such as the CARICOM 10-point plan. The plan outlines debt cancellation for post-colonial nations or health support for the health crises which result directly from enslavement, indigenous genocide, and the resulting stress profiles. Our system works through established state solutions. They present no such warrant. In cross-examination, the proposition said that we can't give to people... I'll take it in a moment. Let me finish this point.
Okay.
They said that you can't give reparations to people who don't deserve those reparations, but they also said that any amount of racial ancestry qualifies. A large-scale DNA study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics concluded that in the US, about 3.5% of people who identify as white have at least 1% African ancestry. That is 7.7 million white citizens they are giving reparations to. If the suggestion is that anyone of a racial heritage background can be given reparations, it's entirely possible that white people could consume a large portion of reparations. Race is simply too vague. Yes, I'll take the point of information now.
Okay, yes. So the opposition said that we did not provide a model for our heritage-based distribution, but we did. We actually mentioned that we would be using DNA testing and ancestry bits, and we also provided two relatively strong examples. So What
Okay,
was your
yeah.
proof with that?
Okay, I understand what you're saying. You said that you'd use DNA testing, but you didn't give a model of how you would distribute it. You said like who is giving this distribution. You said how you would determine it, like who deserves it, but you didn't say who you'd give how you distribute it. That's what I mean. Now on to my point. As stated by my first speaker, European exploitation has underdeveloped Caribbean nations in more ways than one. A glaring example of this is reduced capacity to adapt to and mitigate climate change. The recent Brattle report from the University of the West Indies estimated that Europe owes the Caribbean approximately 19 trillion of today's pounds for its historic wealth extraction and theft. This theft matters because the modern Caribbean struggles to fund climate action. The roadmap for the Caribbean's energy transition puts a price
Point of
tag of $7
information.
billion declined for initial sustainable energy transitions in the region. But 2021 figures from the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, highlight that it is one of the world's most indebted regions with a total debt to GDP ratio of 74% of GDP. This makes even $7 billion for initial energy transitions monumental, and we would need much more financing for health, agriculture, coastal preservation, and more. We had 19 trillion of today's pounds, which Europe stole, and now we cannot come up with 7 billion to even begin sustainable climate transitions. According to the Caribbean Reparations Commission, this colonial theft, which dismantled our climate resilience capacity, means Caribbean nations have a direct claim
Point of
to climate
information.
reparations declined. Under the status quo, Caribbean climate reparations are a godsend we cannot miss by siding with today's proposition. As Barbados's Prime Minister Mia Mottley put it, small island developing states, or SIDs in the Caribbean, face wipeout risk, as in, climate change could destroy entire nations. The United Nations, or UN, has even called the Caribbean ground zero in the global climate emergency, as one of the most high-risk regions on Earth. Hurricane Ivan in 2004 destroyed 90% of homes in Grenada. Haiti's 2010 earthquake left over 1 million homeless and over 300,000 dead. That is what poor infrastructure capacity does. It is only going to get much worse without reparations to deal with this poor infrastructure bequeathed to us. The Council on Foreign Relations predicts approximately 1/5 of all Caribbean wealth will be lost annually to climate damages by the year 2100. Yet still, the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, reports that the Caribbean has been given only a poor fraction of necessary climate aid. Simply put, we deserve climate reparations and we unequivocally need them. And there are a plethora of reasons why this reparative compensation must be distributed according to geographical location and nationality and not racial background or heritage. One reason is that the solutions to climate change are national and regional policies. According to climateanalytics.org, Caribbean nations can prevent future loss and climate damage by developing a common regional approach for climate risk and developing national plans to address climate loss and damage. Another reason is that climate change is intrinsically national and geographical. Entire Caribbean nations will be harmed from poor infrastructure, a byproduct of colonial wealth extraction, when a disaster hits. Moreover, the extent of climate harm is uniquely severe in the Caribbean as a high-risk territory. It is not a form of reparation that can be given out broadly to racial groups. Climate vulnerability is by no means racially uniform. My last and third reason is that nations engage in climate diplomacy, not races. Races alone are not forces in climate diplomacy, such as the COP climate conventions or resolutions through the United Nations, such as the Paris Agreement. Caribbean climate reparations are not only just, but urgent, because the Caribbean faces extreme present danger from these past crimes against humanity. But we can only get this kind of reparation from the opposition. And we would not so swiftly surrender the Caribbean to climate crisis. While race matters, societies matter too. We are immensely proud to oppose this motion. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Kennedy Valley. At this point in time, we're going to dive into another period of cross-examination. This time, however, we will invite the ladies from Holy Faith Convent, Couva, to pose their 3 questions first. Right? So ready when you are, team proposition.
Okay, so the proposition was speaking about climate change. The opposition was speaking about climate change. What does climate change have to do with reparations?
Well, as I outlined, there's a clear case for climate reparations because the colonial wealth extraction led to us not being able to fund the infrastructure for climate change. And it's also urgent because we need those reparations under the status quo because the IMF doesn't give us sufficient foreign assistance. So we need reparations for climate, especially so that we can deal with the urgent climate crisis. It's a clear case for reparations, and we need those reparations.
Okay, next question. If we aren't distributing reparations to victims, but rather to the government, is that not just general state financing?
It's to, you want to answer?
In reality, we would not be distributing to governments. We would be distributing through regulated and monitored organizations, such as the UN Office for Sustainable Development. These monitored and regulated programs can help us to assist in the distribution of these reparations on a national basis, not through national channels.
Okay, third question. Since the opposition made mention that reparations are about restoring oppressed nations, if you are targeting oppressed nations, how can you define them without referencing heritage or history of enslavement and racial targeting?
Could you repeat the question?
If you are targeting oppressed nations, how do you define them without referencing heritage or history of enslavement and racial targeting?
Well, we could base it on enslavement and indigenous genocide, but we don't have to base it on race. There's a clear history and a great deal of literature on the countries which were harmed.
And also, we didn't deny that this existed. As I said in my point, slavery was racial. However, this racial degradation affected the countries by extension and the region in the situation where it happened. So that's why reparations should be given on a geographic aspect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. We now ask you to field your questions, Fatima College.
Okay. So you mentioned racial testing. How would a global program of racial testing for reparations work?
Could you repeat the question, please?
You mentioned that you're going to implement this policy through racial testing. How would a global program of racial testing for reparations eligibility work?
So that program will work simply where a person can go to a clinic where they can access their health records, or through the government office where they can access their ancestry records, which is pretty low cost and is also quite efficient in actually attaining those records, and they'll be easily able to access that and provide it if they were to receive reparations.
Okay. So, okay. Why should people living in formerly colonized, exploited nations receive nothing just because they don't racially qualify?
Well, it's simply because the injustice that was caused, enslavement, colonialization, it was all racially based. Therefore, reparations which seek to compensate those injustices should also be racially based.
Additionally, while colonized nations would have suffered, it was truly the persons who were enslaved who suffered, and they should be the ones to receive compensation and receive reparations in order to get justice for what happened to them.
And hence we are fighting for reparations to be distributed to the group that was racialized.
We have one more question.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you aware that individuals outside of the affected race would have suffered the aftermath of post-colonial society?
They may have suffered the aftermath, however, reparations are by definition about repairing the harm caused to the victims themselves.
And even though they would have suffered, truly, the ones who would have truly suffered would have been the ones directly affected, being the enslaved individuals and the racialized and marginalized groups who were victims.
Okay, thank you. Wait, wasn't that 3 questions?
you.
Do you have to ask questions now?
Of
Yeah.
course. Thank you.
Second period of cross-examination. Gentlemen, and then coming up.
Yeah, hold on. Are you seeing me right now? Wait, who do you want in frame? Oh, okay, Adam, okay.
Mute? Am I muted?
No, you're
This is not my speech. This is not my speech.
Right, ladies and gentlemen,
my speech,
that
that's not my speech.
concludes this period of cross-examination. At this point in time, the debate is going to pause for 1 minute, and during that 1 minute, we will allow the finishing touches to be placed on those reply speeches, after which we'll invite the opposition reply speaker, followed by the proposition reply speaker. And that 1 minute starts now. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is 1 minute elapsed. We now invite Adam Alves to present the final speech from Fatima College.
I will begin in 3, 2, 1. The government makes two claims which not only misunderstand our arguments, but forget the central point of reparations. I am prepared to break down their case systematically, as well as conclude our argument today. The government makes two claims that I will counter. One, reparations based in geography and nationality lead to moral conundrums. Two, nationality-based reparations don't include the diaspora or follow the victim. Well, let's begin. The government claims reparations based in geography and nationality lead to moral conundrums. But the government fails to understand that nationality and geographical regions target not just a race, but the entire societies and all races who have been disparaged. Therefore, I'll ask a simple question to refute this claim. Is helping the entire society, which the affected communities live in, not better than helping just their communities? Nationality-based reparations help entire societies by addressing their unique problems from nation to nation. We observe the need for structural and political reparatory aid in the third most corrupt country on earth, like Haiti, according to the Transparency International. And we could also observe the need for indigenous land and language preservation for the Santa Rosa First People in Trinidad. Using a geographically based system, we can respond to all different types of colonial legacies and help others. Is that not moral to you? Allow me to continue. The government claims that nationality-based reparations don't include the diaspora or follow the victim. But nationality is more than simply where you've been born. Countries today who were affected by enslavement and colonialism understand this. And this idea was put into legal practice in 2025 in Trinidad and Tobago when access to citizenship was granted to all those whose grandparents were born in Trinidad. Ladies and gentlemen, you don't need to simply be born in Trinidad to become a citizen and have access to nationality or citizenship. And this trend follows through us across the entire Caribbean, with Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Grenada, St. Kitts and Nevis, and St. Lucia, and many more Caribbean countries operating on that same idea, as per the Immigrant Invest. Nationality is more than just being born there. So no, nationally based reparations don't forget the diaspora. They in fact include them just as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the government's model of race-based reparations fundamentally oversimplifies history. It reduces centuries of colonialism, enslavement, and hardship into neat racial boxes. Today, the government calls us, and I quote, a charity, but in reality, focusing on race alone ignores the vastly different political, economic, and environmental realities produced in each region. When we look at reparations through the lens of nationality and geography instead of race, we do three things. One, reparations have to resolve colonial systems, not just certain racial groups. Two, racial reparations are convoluted and impossible to truly work out. And three, climate reparations are owed, necessary, and must be given geographically. Expanding on that first point, we do not deny that racial injustice exists within these countries, but repairing the society in which people live in, whether it be schools, economies, and environments, that is how we produce long-lasting change for everyone harmed by colonialism, including racial minorities. Reforming systems is more transformative than simply compensating individuals. Secondly, in society, as racially mixed as our post-colonial nations, race is far too muddled together to serve as a workable basis for reparations. You mentioned DNA, but the cost of it is absolutely astronomical. And this would have to be implemented for every single Caribbean nation, where in Trinidad, nearly 1/5 of the population identify as mixed. This process would be inconsistent, divisive, and administratively unmanageable. Thirdly, national-based reparations allow us to address the climate crisis, which is one of the clearest legacies of colonial extraction. Small island states like those in the Caribbean face rising seas and economic fragility because their economies were designed for monocrop export. Repairing that requires national-level investment, not individual racial payments. Ultimately, reparations must be dynamic, structural, and implementable, features which racial reparations largely fail to do. They must rebuild our nations and communities because the legacy of colonialism is not only written on bodies, but in borders, institutions, and economies. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Mr. Adam Alves. And now, to conclude this debate, we invite the reply speaker from Holy Faith Convent, Couva, Ashley Barras.
I will begin in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chairperson, honorable adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, members of the House, and finally, my worthy opponents, a pleasant good day to you all. Before I begin, I would like to point out the multiple fallacious statements made by our opposition. Firstly, they made various red herrings, particularly mentioning climate change as a factor. How is climate change related? Because right now, I know the proposition knows that this topic being debated is about real harm being done to real people. Furthermore, they committed an ad hominem fallacy by consistently referencing the proposition as you and they and we. But let me remind you all that this debate is between the proposition and the opposition, debating a specific motion. Furthermore, as my Prime Minister mentioned, the 10-point plan is based on heritage, which I would say the opposition ignored as they asked us how exactly the proposition would implement a global strategy for DNA testing. Now, the opposition wants reparations to behave like developmental aid distributed by borders. We insist that reparations remain justice, distributed to people whose ancestors were targeted as racialized victims. Now, I'll be summarizing the points made by my illustrious Prime Minister and my Deputy Prime Minister, who highlighted that reparations must follow victims, not geographical location. That geographic distribution produces moral disparity, that reparations are about repairing intergenerational harm, that nationality-based distribution is unfair and disadvantaging to those who truly deserve it, and finally, that heritage-based distribution holds immense precedent in reparations practice worldwide. Before I begin, the opposition consistently believes that helping the entire society is better than helping the truly enslaved individuals who deserve it. How is that more moral? That is simply convenient, and convenience does not equate justice. Furthermore, the proposition did not say that that reparations don't include the diaspora, but stated that it would be difficult to not exclude them as people are scattered all throughout the world. Firstly, reparations must follow the victim group, not the map. According to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2024, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action recognizes enslavement and the slave trade as a crime against humanity. Is it not true to say that focusing only on nationality alone for distribution of reparations denies and destroys the moral equation, ultimately leading to repair getting separated from who it was meant for, the repaired, the marginalized and racialized groups who were denied what they are owed? Secondly, geographic distribution produces moral absurdities. A nationality-based system leads to disparities among ethnicities. For example, a white descendant of a plantation qualifies for reparations, while African descendants living in the UK do not. Let that sit for one moment. The proposition dubs this as political convenience, masking itself as morality and empathy, rather than what it truly is, a lack of justice. Additionally, reparations are about repairing intergenerational harm. Enslavement is measurable, seen in instances of racial wealth gaps, health disparities, and a lack of educational opportunities for marginalized groups. These harms persist along racial lines, not national ones. The World Bank in 2018 demonstrates that African descendants suffer and remain disproportionately disadvantaged in terms of reparations distribution. Next, nationality-based distribution is inaccurate and unfair, and that heritage-based distribution prevents misallocation. Reparations are designed to repair a specific wrong. That requires eligibility rules linked to victimhood, not geographical location. The UN's reparations framework is victim-centered. Remedy and reparation are owed to victims of gross violations. They deserve it for all that their ancestors had to go through. Finally, heritage-based distribution has strong precedent in reparations practice worldwide. Take the U.S. Civil Liberties Act of 1988. It provided compensation to the incarcerated, a defined victim group, not to all citizens of a specific country. Does this not support the idea that racialized victims who are all part of the same grouping, for example, enslaved individuals, should receive reparations? Precedent proves our model is not only moral, it is administratively recognizable and globally practiced. Let that sink in once more. Globally, internationally, throughout the entire world. To conclude, if we distribute reparations by nationality, we risk paying those who did not suffer the ancestral injury while excluding descendants who did, especially across the diaspora. But when we distribute by racial background or heritage, we honor the central purpose of reparations, to repair a specific, proven, and a historical wrong inflicted on a specific people, and to break its legacy in the present. For justice that is accurate, legitimate, and historically honest, this House must support the motion. I beg to propose. Thank you.
And thank you very much. That was the final speaker of this debate. At this point in time, the judges are going to excuse themselves to another space, and we will return promptly with the outcome of this match.
And this is Ishana Ramli. Reparations are not about the past. They are about justice today. The wealth of empires was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, while our nations were left in poverty.
Generations later, we still live with the same social and economic scars of that exploitation. Reparations mean education, healthcare, and development, not charity, but justice.
If Germany could compensate the Holocaust victims, why can't the descendants of slavery receive the same fairness? Reparations are how we heal history and finally make equality real.
Hey, aren't you the guy that stole my wallet?
Oh, excuse me.
You owe me an apology.
Listen, we must not seek to unpick the past, but rather focus on the future.
What?
As Dr. Eric Williams understood, Caribbean enslavement and indigenous genocide built up European wealth and left our region scarred and underdeveloped.
Here, take a look. We need reparations. It just makes sense.
The Center for Reparation Research is thrilled to launch this international reparation debate competition. This international reparation debate competition that we launched today for secondary schools is one of our most important projects. How do we engage youth on matters of reparatory justice? The change needed in the education system can only be advanced when the youth are engaged and their voices are heard.
Why is reparations so important in and for the Caribbean? Because time comes for justice for our ancestors. Time comes for the Caribbean to insist on the right to development, to be compensated for the violence against our ancestors. So outreach to the young people who have joined this movement is critical.
There is no mass movement that isn't a youth movement. And we certainly want reparations to be a mass movement. So it's really exciting, though, to have a regional stroke international debating competition. And I'm looking forward to your participation as you construct your arguments for and against, remembering that the 10-point plan for reparatory justice is our guiding framework for the areas in which we are demanding compensation, because we certainly want to impact the public opinion and awareness in Europe. So it's fantastic to have the United Kingdom participating as well.
So why is it important for youth to be involved in the reparation movement? Being involved in the reparations movement is critical to youth if one is to know their history so that they can understand why their societies are functioning as they are today. The future of the countries we live in are dependent on the current situation that exists today in our countries. And these current conditions were created by the past, including indigenous genocide, African enslavement, indentureship, and colonization. Being involved in reparations is about seeking justice, seeking a way to reduce inequalities in our own countries and then in the broader world. It's about seeking a more peaceful and balanced world, where global problems are solved in partnerships, not in isolation. I believe the sponsors are hoping this competition will allow our youth to gain knowledge about the past so that as young people, you'll be able to make better decisions in the future and make our countries better places.
We know that we need to understand stories about people that look like us. So the fact that so many of you young people have registered was so encouraged by your enthusiasm and your passion for wanting to enter this debate. It is so important. It's just at the core of who we are that we need to understand where we come from, understand our true history, and having a debate competition on this particular topic is such an important milestone. To have a real conversation about repair, and the fact that our young people were so articulate with their presentations, and to ensure that we keep educating our young people, because you are the future of us and are the Caribbean's a sustainable future. So congratulations, everybody.
We are looking forward to the debate. Encourage everyone to join the debate. Thank you so much, all.
Education about the history of the oppression of a people can either be a tool for liberation or a tool for reinforcing trauma. What allows for education to be one or the other is not the topics taught, but how they are delivered. Therefore, we, the proposition, would like to firmly state that teaching the history of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans, or TTEA for short, does significantly more harm than good, not because of the topic, but because of the current pedagogical approach taken. Your average high schooler learns about the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans through a rigid, standardized curriculum. They are taught by a teacher who is expected to simply deliver information, often in a lecture format, and test students on their ability to memorize facts, years, and names. In this setting, students are not invited to engage critically with the material, ask difficult questions, or relate the content to their own lived experiences. Instead, they passively receive a version of history unable to truly process its relevance, impact, or emotional weight. Where is the opportunity to understand how this horror shaped the blood in our veins and the names we carry? There is none. Students memorize facts and regurgitate them on paper. But inside, the lesson lingers, that the history of the African diaspora is one of subjugation, and that their place in the world is to suffer and survive, not to lead, not to thrive. This is exactly what Paulo Freire, in his work The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, described
as the banking method of education, where students are treated as empty accounts to be filled by the teacher. Freire believed this model was fundamentally oppressive because it prevents learners from becoming active participants in their own liberation. It discourages dialogue, reflection, and consciousness raising. This is what he calls conscientization. The teaching of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans today in many classrooms still follows this harmful pattern. When this topic is taught in a banking method that assumes dichotomy between human beings and the world they live in, Freire says an individual is a spectator rather than a recreator. This kind of teaching doesn't empower, it conditions students to fit into a world shaped by oppression rather than resist it. And that is why we say it does more harm than good, because it teaches history in a way that keeps students passive, not engaged. We learn about Oladoye Equiano, we learn his name, we learn that he experienced this and he wrote an account, but do we open the book and study it and analyze it and discuss it with our teachers the way that Israeli schools discuss Elie Wiesel's night of the Holocaust? The opposition says they want students to learn about the slave trade and the enslavement of people. And of course, we all want all students across the world to have reverence for this grave and absolutely horrific period of history. And we do this with the intention that learning about it can empower them to challenge the lingering legacies of racism and inequality. However, defending the status quo, which our opposition seeks to uphold and claims offers us more good than harm, will not offer us this. This is not remembrance. This is not reverence. And when you trace this system back to its roots, you realize that this is not our system at all. Accepted.
The fact that students today are not listening about the brutality, but also about the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies, creating empowerment more than harm.
Right. Our issue is not with these topics being taught, but it is the way that they are taught and the way that they are emphasized with regards to all of the other things that are occurring within African history. To continue, our education system was inherited from Britain, a colonial power that had no interest in nurturing Caribbean identity or liberation. And what good can we expect from teaching this topic when we are continuing to do so in England's pedagogical approach? Even worse, as you mentioned, African history is taught in the Americas and Europe as though it began with slavery. From primary school, students are introduced to African people not through the glory of their kingdoms, their intellectual traditions, or their achievements, but through their chains. Why is it so hard for you to name a single black figure whose legacy is not defined by resistance or white oppression? Why is it that we teach about Toussaint and Nani but not Imhotep, Mansa Musa, or Queen Nzinga in the same breath? This should be taught first. And compare this to how the Holocaust is taught in Israeli. This is taken from the Israeli Ministry of Education.
Point of information.
Declined. Children are introduced to the brilliance of their culture first, their thinkers, their faith, and their resilience before they are taught about genocide. Their oppression is contextualized within a legacy of strength, not as the first chapter. If that isn't a pedagogical problem, then what is? When slavery is taught primarily as a story of powerlessness and victimization, with the current banking method of pedagogy, it does more than inform. It deeply affects the psychological development of students, particularly those of the African diaspora. During adolescence, a critical time for identity formation, as described in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, students are particularly vulnerable to internalizing messages about their race and their place in history. If the dominant narratives they encounter emphasize subjugation or this constant need to fight without also highlighting pre-colonial civilizations and agency, students may inherit a sense of trauma and inferiority. Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson's 1995 concept of stereotype threat shows that students underperform when they fear confirming negative stereotypes about their group, a common experience for Black students navigating a curriculum saturated with ancestral suffering. In classrooms where Black students only encounter these narratives and are rarely offered examples of greatness before colonial times, they are more likely to fear confirming negative stereotypes about Black intellectual inferiority. And yes, this study found that this did significantly reduce their academic performance. In contrast, we argue for emancipatory pedagogy, which views students as active co-creators of knowledge and encourages reflection, dialogue, and transformation. We want students to read and discuss the first accounts, and this should be a mandatory part of the curriculum, not an option. Additionally, students should be first met with pre-colonial history that showcases the richness and strength of Africans from various tribes and kingdoms before delving into the horrors of the slave trade. Through student-centered dialogic approaches, this topic becomes a detached becomes not a detached narrative of victimhood, but a pathway to critical consciousness where students develop an internal locus of control, a sense of pride, and the tools to challenge injustice. When classrooms prioritize empathy, voice, and critical inquiry over memorization, the teaching of the TTEA can become what Freire calls a practice of freedom, not oppression. We are fully justified in arguing that teaching the history of the TTEA causes more harm than good on the basis of the heavily flawed pedagogy. In parliamentary debate, motions like this are evaluated based on the status quo, meaning how things are actually occurring now. As such, the opposition cannot shift the debate by suggesting that in some ideal future it could be taught differently or argue on the basis of the principle. We are debating the present, and the burden is to defend the way that it is taught now. Thank you.
All protocols observed, the opposition remains resolute against the motion. This House believes that the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans causes more harm than good. We in the opposition agree that there are flaws in the method, but we argue that even in its current form, teaching this history does far more good than harm. We accept the definitions posited by the opposition with the exception of the word harm. Harm caused by the teaching of the trafficking of enslaved Africans in this case is more like temporary discomfort that fosters long-term justice awareness and healing. The proposition burden is to prove that the act of teaching this history is inherently harmful, even when taught well, and that these harms are so deep and widespread that they outweigh all educational and social benefits. We must prove that the current approach generates more harm than good, and 2, the harm is not inherent to the method but as a result of poor implementation, and 3, that the teaching of enslaved Africans creates civic awareness, empathy, prevention of recurrence, and general social progress. The status quo, the history of the transatlantic trafficking in enslaved Africans is already being taught, but with growing care and impact. Students today are learning not just about the brutality, but also the resistance, the rich civilizations before slavery, and the ongoing legacies of inequality. Yes, some schools get it wrong. Reform is being done for more inclusive, trauma-informed, and empowering education, making it the norm. Mr. Speaker, we are not for the current way of teaching this history. The motion didn't state the current way. We are for the best way of teaching this history. Allow me to rebut. And this best way is trauma-informed teaching. This would be training teachers to handle emotional topics with care, no graphic reenactment, use check-ins, and create safe spaces. This builds resilience instead of re-traumatizing students. And 2, balancing the story. Don't stop at brutality. Teach about African civilization, resistance leaders like Nani of the Marus, and achievements of the African diaspora that restores pride and identity. 3, we would center real voices, use first-hand accounts, African scholars, and cultural sources to humanize the content and shift away from cold textbook trauma and link the past to the present, which will let students reflect through debate, which is already being done, and modern connections to racism and justice. This transforms discomfort into action and purpose, including Black educators. Involve Black voices in teaching is as authenticity, prevents tone deafness, and build trust in diverse classroom. This is credible as the RAN program has a similar approach, and it has proven to be working, as it has a 94% increase in the racial unity and empowerment. Allow me to rebut the misconceptions provided by the government. The government stated that teaching of trafficking of enslaved African causes discomfort and psychological harm. But let me say that discomfort is not harm, Mr. Speaker. And the 2019 UNESCO states that students taught slavery alongside resistance have greater empathy and understanding of justice. And secondly, discomfort is necessary for growth and historical reckoning, just like the Holocaust education or genocide studies. They also stated that the current method does not include the history before slavery. But Mr. Speaker, let me say that this is a big misconception. Most syllabi incorporates the history of the Africans before they were colonized. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Mansa Musa. We don't learn about slavery before we learn about Songhai Empire. It is in the rationale also and syllabi that the teachers should use discussions to actually engage the students. In today's debate, I will bring 2 substantive. 1, the current methods build civic awareness, empathy, and critical thinking. And 2, discomfort from learning is not the same as harm. It leads to empowerment. My second speaker will discuss justice and the prevention of repetition in the injustice, while my third speaker will prove why we remain supreme. Our first substantive is the harm lies in the method, not the content. My first warrant is balanced teaching that includes stories of resistance and survival reduces emotional harm and builds empathy. When we emphasize both suffering and human dignity in the trafficking of enslaved Africans by teaching resistance, African agency, and survival, we shift from trauma to empowerment. It does more harm than good because it builds pride, resilience, and understanding. For example, the Holocaust education isn't taught by showing only images of death camps. They come with stories of resistance, survival, and moral courage. It fosters pride, empathy, and moral courage instead of guilt or division. That's why balanced, trauma-informed teaching benefits are supreme. My second warrant is effective, safe teaching already exists and work. We're seeing programs like Facing History and Ourselves offer concrete evidence that teaching hard history can be both emotionally and safe, intellectually enriching. According to a 2021 RAND Corporation study, students in these programs which is a reform program by the way, show that 94% increase in civic agency, meaning they felt more empowered to take social action and reported deeper empathy, stronger historical understanding, and more open-minded attitude. And the fact that we're seeing this in real classroom, Mr. Speaker, proves that harm is not inherent to the topic. It's about how we design the curriculum and support teachers, and we are currently doing this now through reform. If we have models that work, and we do, then the moral burden shifts to improving delivery, not erasing the content. What my third warrant is suppressing this history causes more harm than good. Mr. Speaker, be aware that we're not talking just about the current history. We're talking about the teaching of the history overall, because that's what the mood says. In environments where slavery is ignored or downplayed, misinformation spreads like wildfire. Students grow up believing that slavery was minor, that racism is just a mere relic of the past, or that systemic inequality is simply an overreaction. This ignorance sustains real-world harm, and contrary to this, we're seeing that countries like Germany, who have faced their history head-on with regards to the Holocaust, show lower levels of historical denialism and far-right extremism than those that whitewash. The impact, it promotes social equity and activism, because when students learn this history accurately and empathetically, they become more socially aware, engaged, and ready to challenge injustice. And two, it empowers empathetic, informed citizens who are empowered to fight modern injustice. And three, it protects future generations from repeating injustice. My second substantive is silence enables racism to thrive. My first warrant is when schools avoid teaching slavery, they leave students with distorted or incomplete narratives. In the absence of formal education, when students are left to piece together understanding from biased media, peer opinions, or online misinformation, the result is a deeply distorted view of race and history. A 2018 SPLC report showed that only 8% of the US high school seniors could identify slavery as the primary cause of the Civil War. When students believe that slavery was a voluntary arrangement or that racism ended in 1865, it undermines every effort to promote justice and equality today. Silence gives racism plausible deniability that it suggests falsely that if we don't talk about injustice, it must not exist. The impact, it ensures future generations. And with that, the proposition momentarily rests.
400 years ago. 400 years ago, my people were dragged from their homes, tribes, families, placed on floating wood, and shipped across the Atlantic to what would be later described as the most inhumane act of all time. Cold, dark, uncomfortable, cannot describe the trip in ships where whips did not fail to miss. Injustice.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are back, and we know the team that will be advancing to the next round of competition. The score is ending. One team on 274 points to the other team's 264 points, a 10-point difference. The motion before us read, this House believes that reparative compensation should be distributed based on racial background and heritage, as opposed to geographical location and nationality. So what do we get in the debate? So we get a very interesting and principled appreciation from the team in proposition Holy Faith Convent Couva. And that was, in as much as slavery and enslavement rather was an injustice that was meted out to a particular racial group, intentionally affecting that racial group and disadvantaged disproportionately that racial group, and the entire system of enslavement was surrounding one racial group, that racial group is the one who should receive reparation. And that's a very high order principled and moral analysis, and the judges bought it to some extent. But we wanted to know, in the grand scheme of the pragmatic outcomes that we're getting from Team Fatima, how do we weigh it? So the judges now are here in a position where we're weighing the moral outcomes versus the practical outcomes that we get from Team Fatima. What are those practical outcomes? Well, but Team Fatima concedes that slavery existed and was propagated through individual racial groups. Yes, they conceded on that it was a racial issue, not a system issue. The enslavers didn't come and say, I feel like Jamaica because of its shape or Trinidad because of its shape is really ripe to be exploited. They came here because the individual racial groups, as posed by Fatima, were really good at working in the sun and suffering and giving their crops. So Fatima concedes that slavery existed through racial mechanisms. But Fatima says that the systems that reinforced slavery are what's important. They say that in as much as the Caribbean was used as an exploited settlement, and all of the wealth exited the Caribbean, and because there was no interest in developing the Caribbean, even though it was because of a racial means, the systems that existed became underdeveloped. And it is those systems that we need to solve for. We thought that was an interesting clash of ideas. Then we got into the logistics of it. Yes? So Team Fatima demanded from Team Proposition some analysis of how it is that this is going to be done. What percentage of an individual needs to be attributed as being black or white or Indian in order for them to receive reparation? See, we agree somewhat with Team Fatima that it would have been helpful for your case, Team Holy Faith Convent, if you had given us some sort of mechanization. See, we got that mechanization in as much as you tell us that it is going to be through DNA testing. And first you told us that DNA testing is going to be something that the individual does on themselves and submits as proof for authentication, whether through, for example, Ancestry.com. And then we got an analysis that is actually going to be that individuals are heading into the clinic in order to be tested at a really cheap cost. There was a slight inconsistency there, but this is how the judges resolved it. In as much as this is not a policy debate, rather it is a debate on morality, on what we should do. And it doesn't really matter or weigh that heavily as Team Fatima would want us to believe. So the motion is this house believes and that this house would. So it would have been helpful, Team Holy Faith Convent, for you to mechanize in your opening speech how it is that this is going to be done, but it was by no means detrimental to your case, the fact that you didn't. Right? And so that's how we parse that idea. We got into the idea of climate reparation. So the panel, admittedly, was divided on this matter of climate reparation. The majority of the panel understood the ideas that came from the second speaker from Team Opposition, that was, of course, Kennedy. Yes? For the most part, we understood that assumption. So we understood that in as much as we were used as extractor colonies, there was no capital accumulation within the colonized states. They existed solely for the means of making the colonizers rich. There was no interest in developing our infrastructure and developing our systems. The problem now lies where we have these weakened infrastructure, these weakened systems, these weaker responses to natural disasters because of enslavement. And we are now being in a situation where we're getting a lot of bad outcomes because of climate change, earthquakes and hurricanes and all of these horrible things. And therefore, it is necessary for us to have climate reparation as a very important metric as to why it needs to be regional and not racial. Again, the panel was kind of split on that. The majority of the panel bought the idea, but the entire panel concluded that what would have helped is a more distinct, clear, mechanized analysis of how enslavement leads to us being particularly susceptible to climate change, and then you go into the harms of climate change. You did do a little bit of that, but in order to really convince the panel that it is indeed a direct causation from enslavement, the best we can say is you needed to have done a little bit more legwork improving that linkage. Nonetheless, the majority of the panel bought the idea, and so it was credited in the debate. Now, when we weighed that analysis against the analysis that it is a systematic issue that has caused us to not have good healthcare, not have good education, against the analysis that came from team proposition that there's a moral imperative to ensure that we provide reparation to the individuals who were victims of that reparation, bearing in mind as well that there are going to be fringe cases of individuals who are going to benefit from reparation, who are themselves the people who were victimizing us by virtue of them living in particular regional areas. We think that that's going to happen. We think that by and large that there are when we weigh that, it's a trade-off. Is it worth it to be doing the morally wrong thing in those particular situations, giving people who were our colonizers access to reparation by virtue of them living in the region? When we weigh that analysis against the outcomes that we get from having invested regionally, the judges were able to come to a conclusion. And so the winner of this match and the team that will be automatically advancing to the next round of debate is the team Are you ready, teams?
Yes.
Invite you to unmute. Yes. The team that will be automatically advancing to round 2 of the International Reparation Debate Competition for 2026 is the team in opposition, Fatima College.
Congratulations, y'all did exceptionally.
Y'all did really well.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you for your greetings, and you all did well as well.
Congrats, congrats.
Wait, while we have everyone here, when a motion says should, it's a moral debate, and when it's would, it would be a policy debate. Is there any information we have on this house clauses which would explain that?
Of course. And we are running a little bit late for the next match, so we're going to hop into it. And I'm going to give you a very quick, short answer, but there's a more comprehensive answer that you can reach out to me for. The motion that says that this house believes, or this house prefers, or this house supports, or this house opposes are what we call principled motions. We're calling moral motions, right? The motions that say this house would are motions that necessarily demand a policy, because it's not what a house should do, it's what a house will do. Yes? And so the would necessitates a policy. Now, of course, we can talk about that a little bit more. The best debater from this match comes to us, yes, from the winning team, Fatima College, and that is the first speaker, Hagan Alexander. Congratulations, Hagan. Well played, Holy Faith Convent, Couva. Ladies and gentlemen, Our Lady of Fatima College are our next team who will be automatically advancing to round 2 of this competition. As always, wildcard slots are open, so it may not be the end of the road for you yet, Holy Faith Convent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you at the next match where we'll see 2 more teams playing off. Signal Hill Secondary School versus Herbert Morrison Technical High School. The motion, this House believes that emancipation within the English-speaking Caribbean was achieved due to external factors rather than internal factors. Until then, have a lovely rest of your day.
Same to you.
Same to you.